What is going on, everyone? It's your guy, Cole Jackson, back here on Road Graders, and we have more news as the Baltimore Ravens continue to construct the new look coaching staff. They have hired Anthony Weaver, formerly of the Baltimore Ravens, both as a player and as a coach, as their defensive coordinator to knock it down to 2 out of 3 coordinators hired. So we're going to dive into Anthony Weaver, get to re-know him because we already know him, and talk about my reactions to this news. Because if you guys watch the Ravens Collective, I kind of talked about it. So if you guys are looking forward to this breakdown, hit that like button, hit subscribe if you're new here. I'm almost at 10,000 subscribers, huge milestone for me. So do me a favor, if you're new here, if you enjoy this content, please hit that subscribe button. It does mean a lot to me. Hit like, share it with a friend, all that good stuff. Keep the momentum of the channel going. So I usually summarize at the end, but I want to talk about it a little bit more up front because I think that's really what you guys are looking for. Most of you guys know Anthony Weaver. If you don't, stay tuned because we'll get to that in a second. So overall, I really do like this move, and I'll kind of explain why. And if you guys watched the Ravens Collective on Friday when we broke down Declan Doyle, you kind of heard me already talk about this. So when you take a look at how the coaching staff was filling out, you have Jesse Minter, who obviously is well known for his secondary, background. And when you look at the way he grew up in football, he kind of started with linebackers, became a DC, but when he came to the Ravens, he was a defensive assistant, and then he became a DB coach. And when he went off to Vanderbilt, he was also the safeties coach. And really what I think Jesse Minter became known for was how he coordinated the secondary and coordinated his pass defense. When they brought in Mike Mickens, they gave him the DB role as well as the defensive pass game coordinator role. And that's what Mike Mickens is known for. Really, his work with safeties and corners, as well as the secondary in terms of scheme construction. So what I think this left as a gap is really that front seven and specifically the defensive line. And so when Jim Leonard was kind of getting interviewed here last week, obviously, I think Jim Leonard, in terms of a play caller and an overall DC, I think was seen as a little bit higher than Anthony Weaver. But I preferred to diversify the skill sets that the Ravens coaching staff would have on their defense. And so I was really focused on, okay, who is that defensive line front seven guy? And it really came down to Anthony Weaver and Joe Cullen as two guys linked to the Ravens, linked to Jesse Minter that could kind of come in here and fill that role as a defensive coordinator. I see his role really being, working with the front seven. In terms of coordination, he's obviously going to do a ton of work with Mickens and Minter. There's no doubt about that, but really focusing on things like blitz construction and that front seven and how they can use simulated pressures. That's where I think his focus is going to be, while Minter and Mickens are more focused on the back end. So the reason I like this is I think it really diversifies the skill sets up front. And that's without getting into Anthony Weaver's leadership qualities. I mean, he was a head coach candidate this cycle for a reason. And there's a reason he kept getting kind of like associate head coach roles. Even when he was here in Baltimore, that's really what he was seen at. When I interviewed Brent Urban, I asked him who his favorite coach has been. And he said it was Anthony Weaver. Like that was his guy. And that's all you hear if you talk to people around the building, that they love Anthony Weaver. Players kind of flock to him. He's one of those guys that he's been there. He's done that. He played 7 seasons. He started 103 games, someone they can relate to. I think that really complements what's going on the coaching staff right now. So I absolutely love this hire. And I won't leave this out. I think it was really important for the Ravens to find some more diversity on their coaching staff. A lot of focus on how Mike Mickens was the only non-white guy hired thus far. So I think that's really important as well. And it's nice to see that that's kind of taken shape. So now we jump into a little bit of, who is Anthony Weaver? Where did he come from? So as I mentioned, plays college football at Notre Dame, former Raven and Texan, 103 games over 7 seasons, 257 tackles, 15 and a half sacks. So wasn't just, a camp body. He was actually a very good football player. And he got into coaching, kind of went through the early development that you see. Starts at Florida, starts at North Texas, comes into the Jets in 2012 as an assistant D-line coach, ends up in Buffalo in his first full D-line coach role, goes to Cleveland before ending up with the Texans. And that's really where his career as a coach took off. And the one thing about those Houston Texans defenses in the later 2010s, they always had a good run defense, always in the top half of the league. And he had some great bodies on there, guys like Whitney Mercilus, Jadeveon Clowney, JJ Watt, all part of those defensive lines. And then he gets rewarded in 2020 with the defensive coordinator role. And it says defensive coordinator. If you look Houston Texans 2020 line, it says DC and defensive line coach. I don't know if he'll have the D-line coach role here, but I expect that's really what his specialty is going to be, as I mentioned. Then he comes to Baltimore in 2021, and that 2021 hiring was really part of a revamp of the coaching staff. So in 2020, under Wink Martindale, they had guys like Joe Cullen, Mike McDonald, Jesse Minter, Zach Orr, who stayed with the team. But then when you go into 2021, they lost Minter, Cullen, and McDonald. Minter went to that was when Minter went to Vanderbilt. Mike McDonald went to Michigan, and Joe Cullen, I believe, went to Kansas City for a bigger role. And so they brought in Anthony Weaver to really, kind of restore some of that coaching staff, and kind of, I believe they brought in Rob Ryan for inside linebackers at the same time, and I believe at that time Zach Orr moved to outside linebackers. Then you take a look at where he goes from there. I thought it was really interesting. 1 year in Baltimore, and John Harbaugh rewards him with an assistant head coach role. That to me really speaks to his leadership. Usually you do that when you want to keep someone. You want to reward them, but also give them a bump in pay before another team kind of poaches them. So he stays here for 2 years. And really what led to him going to Miami was hiring Zach Orr instead of hiring Anthony Weaver when they lost Mike McDonald at the end of 2023. And that's been a very interesting discussion because we know how it went with Zach Orr. And it makes you wonder, did the Ravens make a mistake in not keeping Anthony Weaver as a defensive coordinator? So I think that's really interesting as a piece of this puzzle. So then he goes off to Miami. He's there for 2 years under Mike McDaniel, where he really ran that defense because McDaniel's focus on the offense. And part of that as well, I don't think he really had a ton of support on that coaching staff. You take a look at some of the assistants they had. Joe Barry was there and played the defensive run game coordinator role, but that was pretty much it. So Anthony Weaver was really running that unit, and we know how things went in Miami. They weren't overall pretty good. When you look at the results, 2025, 24th in points, 22nd in yards, 13th in run D, though. That run D, he's usually pretty good at putting together a good run D unit, but 25th in pass D. You look at 2024, where they were much better as a defensive unit, and it really shows that rollover in Miami from a personnel perspective and how things just kind of went downhill as a team. They were 10th and 4th in points and yards, 21st in run D, so a little bit less there, but 15th in pass D. I think what's really interesting, and this really stood out to me, so where it says ADOT, the third line in the right-hand column, that's average depth of target as a defense. And so I found this interesting because the Baltimore Ravens were third last in the league last year, and I believe they allowed 8.8 average depths of target. And we know why. It's because Zach Orr played that soft scheme and just easy completions underneath their defense with no pass rush. And so I thought it was interesting to see them so much lower. I believe it was around 6.2 and 6.4, if I remember the numbers correctly off the top of my head. What that tells me is there's a little bit more aggressiveness in Anthony Weaver's defenses, and I'll be interested to see how that carries over. A couple of things that I did notice: 24th and 23rd over the last 2 years in missed tackles. That's obviously part of coaching. It's also part of their player coach, their positional coaches. And it's something to think about, something to keep an eye on. Another thing that stood out to me in 2025 is, they haven't had good pressure percentages, and we know the Dolphins were kind of struggling with their pass rush. They went out and got Bradley Chubb, ended up trading him. I believe they got rid of Jalen Phillips as well. But seeing 17th and 8th in blitz percentage, that's an interesting piece because I do think he's going to be part of coordinating the front seven in terms of blitz and sim pressures. So it's good to see him with a high blitz percentage. I think what would be concerning was just not getting a pass rush, and that's really where the Ravens' concern is. So if there's a criticism, or not a criticism, but a concern I have, and we'll have to see how this plays out, it's how can Anthony Weaver help develop a pass rush here in Baltimore without just being blitz heavy all the time? I think that's one of the key questions the Ravens have. I think that's talent related, and I think it's scheme related, and it'll be really interesting to see the difference. So we know that under that Zach Orr scheme, felt like we were seeing guys like Mike Green and contain rushes all the time. How is that going to change in an Anthony Weaver defense? So that's one of the things that I'll be keeping an eye out, under Jesse Minter, under Anthony Weaver, to see how those things come together. So something we'll definitely take a look at when we look at their scheme in depth and kind of get into the film, because he was a defensive play caller in Miami. So we have very specific examples. The question really becomes, what is his role going to be under Jesse Minter? How is Jesse Minter going to assign roles? I'll be really interested in seeing, do they end up bringing in a run game coordinator, or just by de facto of Anthony Weaver having that defensive coordinator role and Mike Mickens having the defensive pass game role, if that's kind of like his pseudo role without putting a title on it. So it's going to be really interesting to see how some of these things play out. But overall, as I mentioned at the start of the video, I think they really did a good job of diversifying their coaching staff here. I think this hire makes a ton of sense. And I'm just really happy that they kind of got this done. I think this answers a huge question, and now they kind of move on to some of their assistants, and we start to kind of really finalize what this coaching staff looks like. And then we can start to shift gears into the draft and, finding guys that are going to come in here and be better, talent upgrades for these coaches. So overall, those are my thoughts on this hiring. Do me a favor, hit that like button if you enjoyed this breakdown. Hit subscribe if you're new here. As I mentioned, I'm almost at 10,000. Really want to get there this week. Let's see if we can do it. I think we got about 140 to go. So be part of that change. Be part of the movement. Thank you all for tuning in. And as always, my friends, be good to yourselves. Be good to each other. Peace out, everyone.